very quickly, I have set up Microsoft Teams backend. I'm going to be, for everyone else, if you're new here or you're not, which is fine, Microsoft Teams is going to have all of the study groups either as a Zoom link or YouTube link for the full videos. Going forward, if I'm using the Zoom link and you're using the Zoom link, there will be a password set for each month, so that way it's changing, but if you're here in person, it won't matter. The teams I'm going to put, as you guys have seen, and Darian was interacting a little bit, all you guys have commented and got through the back end. I'm going to post little content, little snippets about moment arms, about resistance profiles in this case, and try to have some continuing education. What I like about the Microsoft Teams backend is it kind of works out being like a private Facebook group, so to speak, just for our community. And you have all the resources. I'm going to share as much as I can. If we have a conversation from one of these meetings and you're like, I didn't get that part, I have a question about this, I want to know more about this, please, if you're open to it, either in the public channel or privately, message me the question and we can either address it publicly or in the next study group. Because I think that the best questions really come organically from these conversations and then blend forward as we move forward. So if anyone who's on the Zoom call has a question, please type it if I'm talking, or interject if you want to really get involved, and I'll try to comment it along the way. And yeah, one thing that we will be doing is I'm going to make sure that these study groups for the foreseeable future are progressive. So every conversation we have on a Friday will blend into the following Friday. So coming January, there will be a much more standardized curriculum for each year, which will kind of blend into the project stratum, technical and business development. But we're going to kind of stumble through a few of these things together. And I want everybody who's here to let me know how this goes. So Lou, just because you don't know this yet, but for everyone else that's here, Mr. Darian Matt is a new trainer that started at the facility. And he's just kind of learning about some of our process. And I think what I'm going to do to make this a really interesting few Fridays is I'm going to try to do everybody that works here's profile so we can talk about it, provided people feel comfortable talking about it. Darian, are you okay if I share? Are there any pieces of information that we talked about you don't want me to share?
Everything. Go ahead.
Cool.
Big 14-year-old.
Big 14-year-old. Yep. So first thing to notice, I do have atrocious handwriting. I'm a much more visual thinker, so a lot of these things are much more like hieroglyphics for me to help me identify what I'm looking at. And I actually did this profile slightly different than I do most clients to make it easier for this study group. So very quickly, these mobility profiles for me are the starting point for when I'm personal training or using exercise with a client. All of this information gives me baseline data to know from a mechanical perspective or motion perspective where they are and are there differences from one side to the other. The only principle that I want to be thinking about today is the biological law of symmetry. And I'm not really focused and aimed toward getting things 100% symmetrical. I'm not chasing that symmetry, and I'm not going to freak out if we don't get there. However, we do know that biological systems that operate closer to being symmetrical do move efficiently. The closer we are to symmetrical, motion is a lot easier and it puts less stress through the rest of the system. It's more efficient and costs less energy, less muscle, less food. And this is a perfect example without even talking about symmetry. Even our gait, the way we walk, most of us can walk for a long distance and really have no problems without wasting any energy. But as soon as you say, I want to walk really slow for a kilometer, or walk really, really fast for a kilometer, or for a mile, all of a sudden that completely changes it because the efficiency of the gait cycle gets thrown out the window. And now we're taking away the efficiency of momentum. With someone who's really not symmetrical for some sort of structural reason, whatever it may be, motor control reason, they're going to move slightly different from one side to the other. And in my opinion, creates a really, really great opportunity to create some unique exercise scenarios to help potentially try to change them, but if not change them, at least respect them. So what I liked about with Darian here is it's the same stereotypical thing that I think is if you take a 24-year-old person, you say, I've got a 24-year-old person and this person exercises regularly. If I said, hey, do you think this 24-year-old should not exercise? Are there any exercises that a 24-year-old should avoid doing? Most people would say, no, 24-year-old who exercises, they're probably quite fit, especially if they look fit. So therefore, they probably can do anything. Well, with Darian, we already start to get some evidence that there potentially might be some options, but that might not be as efficient or body lucrative, if you will, for him to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through Darian's profile. He actually had a pretty simple profile, even though there's a lot of line markers up here. And quickly, as I've done before, I'm going to talk about what each one of these lines mean. What we're going to do next Friday is we're going to continue the conversation of taking basic data points, like starting maybe just with analyzing a standing posture picture and going, okay, with the standing posture picture, what can we infer might show up from a biomechanical perspective? So Mr. Darian is 14 years old because my writing's terrible, 24. Darian Matt, he is left-handed. So laterality, right to left-handedness certainly does come into play sometimes, but not that much. It really where it pops up is if you see a girth asymmetry difference from one side to the other of a quarter inch, more than a quarter inch rather, then I start raising an eyebrow and wondering, is there something weird going on here from a atrophy or hypertrophy perspective? I measured Darian's appendages. I measured his arms, kind of the standard measure points, and his legs. Of all 7 points that I measured from the wrist, the forearm, deltoid tuberosity, upper thigh, lower thigh, he didn't have any differences when I made your measurements. You were symmetrical in all those spots, which was kind of cool. When I was doing the postural assessment, so we do two different forms of posture assessment. We do a standing postural assessment and a supine postural assessment. Why I think doing a postural assessment is valuable just in general is that if the architecture is facing a slightly asymmetrical direction, your car's kind of turned to the left, it's going to influence how well it can perform with all the dynamic stuff, which direction the frame is facing. Ultimately, even though we are exercise and muscle professionals, it's really going to come down to the joint health and how the joints operate that's going to truly dictate how well we can move and perform exercises. How I mean that is you could have a motor control deficit where there's some weakness from a surgery, stress, whatever it may be. And you might see decreased range of motion from that. But if the joint architecture is damaged, compromised, or facing a slightly different direction than the other side, no matter what you do to the skeletal muscle, if you get it super, super strong, it's never going to allow, quote unquote, an increase in range of motion. And a perfect example, which Darian does not have, is a joint replacement, like a hip replacement. Hip replacements, like ceramic hips, have an inherent limit as to how much motion will be available. It's much like the joint of a car, not exactly, but like a ball, any sort of ball joint. We'll say like the door hinge on a car door, is that car door hinge has a lot of motion, but there's a point where it won't be able to go much further because you're going to hit that barrier. And this is where it becomes hard when people talk about comparing apples to apples. We do know that right to left symmetry is important just based off of some biological principles, but when you have someone who's got joint damage, structural difference from one side to the other, even a labral tear, herniated disc that's asymmetrical, all of these things are going to create an almost impossibility for full, perfect symmetrical range of motion to occur. Maybe not, but in a lot of scenarios it will. And so I have a lot of clients personally that have knee replacements and hip replacements, and this is where it's almost impossible to compare apples to apples. So that's one of the reasons why I like doing postural assessments, is because it gets an idea, gives us a framework as to where the individual is facing. And if we see range of motion differences or flexibility deficits, do any of those flexibility deficits truly make sense? Do we need to try to stimulate some muscles, potentiate muscles, stretch some muscles, whatever your method is? Do we need to do that? Or is there actual evidence that it might not have anything to do with those muscles? I'm saying evidence-wise, but it might actually have to do with the direction of the architecture. Now, one of the reasons why standing in supine posture is so important, doing both, in my opinion, and frankly, you could do seated and you could do prone if you really wanted to be expansive. I have found that doing just these two is suffice, but if someone's in excruciating pain or weakness, I might do a prone posture or a seated posture. Sometimes doing both of these assessments is really valuable. Because when people are standing, if you take an individual and we take the hormesis of the dosing of the weight of the individual influenced by gravity and the amount of time that they've been standing, if you have someone who is supremely weak relative to their body weight, right? And this doesn't necessarily mean someone who's overweight, but if you have someone who's extremely deconditioned and they don't really stand for more than a few minutes, it is possible that when they're standing, the level of contraction that they have available, force output, relative to their weight, they might have they might be working close to their 1 rep max of standing for 60 seconds. And what happens when people are working near their maximal force production level and how they stand or how they move? Most people modify how they move, because innately when we stand, we have an organization of all of these different joints and muscles that turn into this amazing supreme skill of standing upright. But standing upright as a closed system like the human body is an organization of so many contractions, so many joints, so many different sensory receptors that say, hey, this is a good joint, this is not a good joint. We might have some problems over here, we might not have some problems over here, and turns into this standing posture. When you lay someone on their back, you take a lot of that force away because now you have so much more surface area on the table. And that body weight, if it weighs 100 pounds, is more evenly distributed over many contact points, as well as the actual shapes of the human body. So how interesting is it if we see differences in posture from one side to the other? Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions about that? There he is. Cool. So we're going to kind of continue here. So when I'm looking at even just the black lines here on, can I make this bigger? When I'm looking at just the black lines here for Darian, I'm going to go talk about some bigger markers that stand up, and I'll just mention each one. So when I was looking at Darian, start at the head, his head was tilted up to the left and down to the right from one side to the other. So looking at it just from a front view, he kind of had this going on a little bit when he was standing. Not a lot, just a little. Going down to his shoulders, if I put my hands on the top of his acromions and also on his clavicles from the anterior view, we found that when he was standing, ST, his left shoulder was higher than the left and then lower on the right. Now, it was interesting. Well, I'll come back to that in a second. So that was just standing. Also, when he was standing, he was slightly rotated in his rib cage to the right. So if I looked at his side view, you could see that his left pec shoulder complex was slightly more anterior. One thing that I often do as I manually will rub my fingers down the spinous processes and the erectors of all my clients from a standing neutral position and a slightly flexed position. And why I like that slightly flexed position is because it kind of points all the spinous processes out. So if there were any structural asymmetries from one side to the other in the spinous processes, if there was a flex or an extended lesion that was really bad, if there's any atrophy in the spinal erector tissue, we might actually be able to feel that. Sometimes not, but sometimes you might actually be able to feel that. So with Darian, when I did both of those assessments, spinous process touching, erector spinae touching, posterior erector tissue, between regular posture and a collapsed terrible posture, I did find that in his erector system on the lumbar spine on the bottom right, there was less girth in the muscle there compared to the left side. So it was less full over here than over here. But when we go up to the thoracic spine, the erector tissue felt the same from one side to the other. Continuing down with the standing posture, we had this line here where his pelvis, when I put my hands on the top of his iliac crest, was slightly higher on the left compared to the right. So without getting into any other information, just looking at those few different line entries, we can already see that he's kind of got this favoring to the right side, where he's down on the right, turn to the right, down on the right, a little bit of atrophy on the right. Now, interesting, if we just took these 5 pieces of information, atrophy, pelvic system, where the innominate are facing, where the shoulders are facing, and where the head's facing, where he's rotated. Have you guys ever, I find this really interesting, but have you ever seen someone who has like nerve damage in their hand or their arm? Cerebral palsy is an example of this, where they've got damage. And when they've got that damage, what happens is there's kind of this like swanning inwards. So part of the reason that I've read that this happens is since you have so much more larger muscles on the flexor side of the system of the arm, that swanning kind of everything kind of just tightens up a little bit, but it pulls it towards the stronger muscles, if you will, or there's a little bit more tonus. Now that doesn't necessarily apply here, but it's really interesting to see that he does have all of this right side stuff going on. He's got this atrophy here. Very simply, if we just think about this from an engineering perspective, where if he had 2 pillars in his back that were trying to hold him upright, if we removed one of those pillars, the whole bridge would kind of tilt down towards that right side, which is kind of like, and I don't know for sure, but just to try and really make this super basic, just to help us start understanding this, it kind of looks like that's what's happening. Where you remove this pillar on the one side, he's got this collapsing that happens and this rotate that happens to that side, because from an engineering perspective, there's potentially less stability there. So I have this hypothesis starting off when I got to this point with Darren. I'm like, I wonder if there's something going on with this atrophy in his lower back, because that's a big piece for someone who's a young recreational exerciser. 14 for a 14-year-old, he certainly has got a lot of atrophy in his lower back. Hopefully it's just puberty, and then hopefully that kind of picks up on the other side. He's just growing asymmetrically and then shoots out to the other side. So coming down here, if we continue with the standing assessment, both of these lines here, well, this is kind of, we're getting into standing and supine assessment. So from a standing perspective, when I measured his, or I put my hands underneath the arch of his feet, his right foot was pronated and his left foot was supinated. So how I figured this out, it's not so much I'm saying, well, one's supinated and one's pronated. It's just that one was pronated, which in turn means that the other one is relatively more supinated. So I don't know if one's supinated or one's pronated, but if one's collapsed and the other one's not, it's either this one's too high or this one's too flat. But I'm going to mark down both because I actually don't know. I can't make any inferences off of each one. Which, if you're interested in the whole pronation supination topic, the Minds on Muscle episode that I did with Glenn, I think that aired on Monday or last Monday, was the foot orthotics friends or foe episode, and we talk a little bit more about this, which I think is kind of a fun conversation, both from an exerciser perspective and a client perspective. So when I laid Darian on his back, we started seeing some consistencies and then some slight changes. So his right foot was plantar flexed, left foot was dorsiflexed, but it's kind of weird because, like, if you guys have studied the pronation supination gait cycle model stuff, it looks like we're kind of getting this collapsing overall on this side and this lifting up on this side, because if we're supinated on this side, it is possible that when I'm supinated, relatively speaking, I might be slightly dorsiflexed. And then if I'm collapsed on this side, my mid-tarsal joint or my forefoot is kind of dropped down, it could relatively look like plantar flexed. So I don't know, but we do have this mirror opposite, where there's kind of opposite things happening on both sides. As we come up, we see more of this left to right weirdness, so to speak, where his right knee is slightly flexed and his left knee is slightly extended more. And how I do this, I just put my hands underneath the back of his knees, and I put my hand on the back of his left knee, and it was pretty tight, couldn't get my hand underneath there. I get my hand under the right knee, and I could slip right underneath. So positionally, there's a bit of a difference there. Just observing his hip position, his right hip and the left hip, his right hip is externally rotated, his left hip is turned in. Same kind of thing, where I look at what's going on, and I'm like, is it one internally rotated, one externally rotated? I don't know. But if one's internally rotated compared to the other, that means, relatively speaking, this one's more externally rotated to this one. So that's where we get this kind of, both those lines there. There's just a general turning to one direction. Coming up, more direction to the right. When he was laying on his back, and I put my hands on the top of his ASIS, or his front hip bones, slightly rotated to the right, which seems to be cooperating with the standing posture. Here's where things gets fun. I found this kind of interesting. Just told you guys when he was standing, we had this big collapse down to the right side, right? And when he was standing, when I put his feet onto two separate scales, he had 4 pounds extra weight on his right foot compared to his left foot. So that was kind of interesting to me. But what was a little weirder, which I always find kind of weird, is when he laid on his back, the orientation of his iliac crest actually switched a little bit, where the left side was down and the right side was up. So if I've got something like this going on, this kind of this X here, I always feel terrible when I draw a big X on like a client's paper, because I don't want it to be like I'm putting an X through their hips or their shoulders and saying there's a big problem. But why, in your opinions, why might something like this happen, where standing, like this, in this particular example, right? When he's standing, right pelvis is down, left is up. When he's supine, right is up, left is down.
The gravity forces the hips kind of back in place.
On the back, the supine position? Yeah, to be honest, you're absolutely correct. Because, and how I like to think of it is that, so Lou, so there's going to be a better microphone. It's actually coming right now. So you'll be able to hear everybody else in here Wednesday. But what Anna...
Also wearing masks, it makes it harder to talk.
Yeah, I'm the only one that's not wearing a mask from this end, just for the communication. Everyone else is wearing a mask. So there'll be a microphone. It'll be easier to hear. But what Anna said was that, is gravity kind of is there an influence of gravity on the table with this piece? So let's just think about this for a second. And I can't really draw this super, super well, but let me know if this makes sense. If we do indeed have this big atrophy here, right? and Darian having some muscle on his body. He's got a big hole here, so to speak, and very visually speaking, and not a hole here. When he lays down on the table,
It becomes less relevant than when he's standing.
well, perhaps. I
don't mean, okay, I misused the word relevant. What I meant to say, Miss Anna, is he doesn't have the opposing force of gravity pulling him directly down. It's dispersed over his body.
Yes, so that gravity influence from a foot perspective is absolutely different because now he's not putting that weight through his feet. He's got less joints stacked on top of one another. But he still is having his body, the physics of his body, pushing into the table. And if it's a really firm plinth or a really soft plinth, that does make a difference. But just thinking about this almost from like a Lego, I like to think of it like Lego because it makes it easier for me because my inner child loves Lego. But if we had this big hole here. What's that?
We should come over. We have so much of that.
Oh, I'm going to have a bunch of Legos with the young guy. If we have this big hole on the one side and this big erector on the other, when Darian lays down on the table, because he's got this hole here and this big firm bit here, he has all this extra space on that right side where the erector is. So if he's got that extra space, that does create an opportunity for the weight of his torso to rotate him towards that until he finds an equilibrium between those two pieces. Right? I mean, it's like, even though he's a symmetrical creature, bones are the same shape, if he's got different girth, think of it like this instead of even just muscle, is if he was 100% symmetrical and there was no atrophy difference, but I took some sort of riser and I shoved it underneath the left side of his low back, he would be rotated to the right side a little bit. And so to me, that's that kind of Lego stacking idea, is that might actually be giving us what we're seeing with this right side rotation here, which to me, when I got to this point in the assessment, I'm still kind of thinking this atrophy might be a big thing. And this actually might be one of my biases because this is such a dense area that when I see atrophy in the midsection, it kind of goes a long way. It could go a long way. I don't know for sure. Does that, as far as seeing these crisscrosses and these differences from standing in supine, does that make sense? Taylor, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Liz, what do you think? Is that what you were kind of saying with the relevant stuff?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Darian?
I'm just like thinking about this, like all like what's happening in here now too, where I'm like looking at this, then you're saying stuff, and then I'm like realizing like it is stuff that like, so like for example, when I was like lying on the table, there's like a part of me like in terms of why you were saying like my right side is generally kind of like I'm like rotated to the right. When I'm lying down, it's almost because like while I'm lying there, I can like consciously feel the difference in like how I'm lying, like feeling like which glutes on the table, like which side I feel more. So then I'm trying to like consciously like fix that. So then by doing that, that might be why I'm like hiking up my right side while I'm lying down.
Yeah.
Or just because you can.
Because it like feels weird. Like I don't know how to explain it. Like it's just like I can feel that something's different. I've always known I do have atrophy in my right side, in my lower back. I've never known like what to do.
Spend a lot of time standing, like just standing for hours and hours on your feet?
Sometimes, yeah. Like generally speaking, I would say. But
well,
like
you bring up a really interesting point, and I think it'll have to be a conversation for another day because it brings up another element just from a client perspective. But how someone's thinking about their orientation on the table. Like I've got a lot of clients who are mechanical engineers, like Andrew Moore and a few others, and they are so mechanically thought-provoked that when they think about something like you're talking about and they feel something in their back, they instantly try to modulate their position so it feels like they're balanced. But what's really hard is that if you have a deficit, that's an anatomical difference at this point. It's not just like a functional, I stub my toe and it's different. It's that it become anatomy over time. It's really hard to supersede that because it gets weird. Like if you have this atrophy and you're standing lots of time and you're like, okay, well, I feel like I'm crooked. I'm going to make it so I don't feel crooked, right? What ends up, you see a lot of this is that people actually overcompensate and what feels like is balance really isn't. And if you've worked with clients with right to left differences, like how many times have you guys worked with someone and you do something and they look more same from right to left to you and they're like, I feel off balance now.
yeah.
So that's always an interesting thing for
Because
sure.
their body is trying to compensate the movement, so they're thinking they're balanced, but when you fix the posture, it's actually off balance for them.
Yeah, 100. I like that. It's exactly like if someone stubbed their toe every single morning, they would just start to feel like this is a normal thing. And then one day they don't stub their toe and they're like, whoa, I feel like I should have stubbed my toe this morning. I feel like I'm off balance. Lou, just the postural information. Do you have any questions or thoughts about this? Have you thought about this kind of stuff before?
Yeah, no, this is really, really interesting. I haven't, looked into it in this much, depth, which, this is awesome. I'm wondering, like, when you took the measurements and stuff, did you tell him to just try to stand as straight as he can, or like when he was supine, just say try to lay as straight as you can, or what was the thing before that? Like, what did you tell him to do?
Great question. To be honest, I really try to just have them be as natural as possible, because I don't want, and this is one of the challenges, that I don't want to force them into a position. Like, I won't say, hey, can you stand here and stand up straight? Because instantly it's to the same point is if you're thinking about your posture, then all of a sudden, if you say, here, stand here and stand straight, they're going to change how they're standing. Frankly, for all measurements, and you guys will catch me doing this with clients, which kind of goes against some of the, we're talking about professionalism stuff. I try to distract my clients as much as I can from thinking about their body if they're a body conscious person. Like, I have a new client who's actually a gym teacher, and she's so aware of her body that if she's thinking about her body, the way that she stands is 100% different than how she stands when she's relaxed. I want to know when someone's not thinking about their body, not making changes, how are they standing? So for measurements, I won't have them flex. For postural analysis, lay on the table, unless they're doing something crazy, if they're laying on the table like this, I won't cue them to lay any different. I'll just say, hey, can you lay on the table and just lay relaxed? I'm just going to observe how your body is from one side to the other. Generally, the subconscious orchestration is going to give you much more information than when you force something. Because it gets weird when you start forcing something. You say, hey, can you lay there and point both feet straight ahead? All of a sudden, you've now have them, they're contracting their system. And that's great that they are, but what happens if the way that they feel balance is actually a totally different scenario? Kind of like potentially Darian was saying that he might be contracting himself into a weird position or not. What if someone's so good that they can actually make themselves look symmetrical, but as soon as they lay down and they relax, they lay like this? So yeah, I'm a big fan of what are you doing when you're not thinking about your body? I'm a big fan of that. But having someone contract their body does go a long way. Does that help a little?
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So there's only one other thing with Darian that I wanted to talk about. And this was something, and this is why I like to do such rigorous data analysis and heavy lifting up front, was that I always ask people, hey, because a lot of clients will come in, right, and they have a fitness goal or a pain goal or whatever it may be. And I'll always ask them, hey, can you tell me a little bit about your disease history? Can you tell me about if you're on any medications? And I always find it really interesting, the stuff that people don't talk about. Like the number of clients, I mean, jokingly aside, the number of clients that you're working with a back problem, they go, oh yeah, I busted my hand when I was 7 years old and wore a cast for 2 years, but it's no big deal. Like those kind of things are super prudent to me. And I want to know, like, oh, so you like using your hand for work and you busted your hand and you have elbow problems, but it's not okay. Well, one of the things that popped up with Darian is that he mentioned to me that he has, without too much detail, just different depth perception on his right eye compared to his left eye. Now, this is the stuff that I like to find out about someone that has good organization, posture, and is quite strong. Because if someone has, now Darian didn't really have any back issues, to be quite honest with this, but when he mentioned this, have you guys ever worked with a client that has, I was gonna say one eye, but like blind in one eye, or half blind in an eye? What do they do? Yeah, they have an eye patch on. Well, what do they, if you look at them head on, how do they look? Like, how are they looking through their eye? Like, they're not necessarily.
They're trying to compensate with the second eye.
Yeah, so if I put an eye patch on, right, we need people, what I'm gonna do is because I'm trying to maintain, like for so many different systems, for balance, like maintaining equilibrium to the ground, depth perception, so I know how far things are away from me. I mean, just being able to interpret physics. That's why we have two eyes, because they help us kind of connect everything. If I cover one, this looks hilarious. If I cover one, right, I'm going to move, like Anna said, I'm going to move my one eye kind of forward to be kind of like the Cyclops of the whole scenario. And that's where if you have someone who, and I was actually at Persicini's, so this is like 8 or 9 years ago, there was a lady, and it was the same kind of thing. She came to see me. She wanted to get a stronger, her neck was killing her. Seen a chiropractor said, you got to get your neck stronger, go to these guys. So she came in and she had all these neck issues, and I was trying to do some neck assessment. And then when we're looking through her history, she has a glass eye. But it was such a great glass eye, I never would have noticed. I'd known her for years and I never saw the fake eye. So when I started looking at her and she's looking at me, I started noticing that she's doing this a lot. Now, Darian's eye is not glass eye worthy. At least if he did, he fibbed and didn't tell me the truth. But we do have a different than depth perception. Well, that would be cool. If we had a cyborg eye, that would be just awesome. If you had a cyborg eye, I want to know where I could get one. You're like a step towards Neuralink. That'd be awesome. But this is the continuum, is if someone has, right, thinking about the extremes, I have 2 healthy eyes. Well, I don't. I have 2 okay eyes. You take someone who's got 2 perfect eyes, and you take someone who's completely blind. You have this continuum of, black to white, where someone's looking straight ahead and their head's perfectly symmetrical. And you got the blind person, one eye blind, and they're kind of moved completely. Well, what's the continuum in between? Because if someone has slight depth perception difference, and this goes not even just eyes, but, TMJ, pain in the shoulders. If someone has a slight difference where the one eye is just kind of fuzzier, even just a different prescription, you won't even notice, but you might have someone who's doing this kind of thing. Because when this heads back about an inch more, the inch difference actually helps them have a level perception of their field of view. And that's not our expertise. We're not eye folks. But if we do have that difference, what we do have to respect is how that influences the mechanics of the system. How is that person going to operate if their career is dependent on their vision? They're on their feet all day. They're watching clients, and they got one eye that's slightly different. They're going to be watching all their clients slightly like this.
Exactly. You cannot fix that because you cannot make them even.
Yes, you can't make them even. And this is what's the hard thing, and this is the apples to apples conversation. Because say, hypothetically speaking, say Darian came in and he's like, my neck's been killing me for 17 years. I've tried everything.
Yeah, I'm
He's 14. So when I was in the womb, my neck was hurting. Okay, right? So say my neck's been killing forever. I've tried everything, and my neck's not getting better. My chiropractor told me, you're a wonder with exercise, and your exercise can help people's necks feel better. And you get all this information, and you say, great. How will you know you've succeeded? Well, my neck is 100% symmetrical. When I look at the mirror, I don't see a difference with my eyes. I don't see a difference with my head position. You go, okay, that's great. That's logical if we're working on neck. And then you read this eye thing. How plausible is it that if someone's got this difference, that we're even going to be able to get them to a symmetrical playing field with their neck?
Because their vision will be compromised.
Well, yeah. If that would be awful. If you even got that symmetry, like Anna said, their vision would be different because they'd be really good looking this way, but not straight ahead. If there's an anatomical difference with how the actual organ functions, it's never going to be the same because he's always going to need to be like this to interpret his world. But is it possible to get enough information to find out the influence of this eye on the rest of the system and reduce its field of effect to being smaller? I think so. I really do think so, because it really is just a slight cervical rotation position change. And that's fine if he's been doing that for as long as he's been alive. But are there influences down the chain? Because we know that the axial spine system, even though we anatomically will sectionalize it to occiput, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, that's great. But if I take a spine column and I grab the sacrum and I grab the top and I twist the cervical spine slightly, the whole spine segment's going to turn slightly. And that's fine. That's a great thing to know. But what does that do to the costal facets on the side that we're rotated to? What does it do to scapular mechanics? Well, for Darian, is it possible that the mechanics that we're seeing here is actually what's causing this whole dip down to the one side? but he slightly rotated and collapsed down with his head to the one side because he finds that this and I'm not trying to, I'm exaggerating with my positions. You're not as bad, right? But if he's kind of like this and he finds that his eyes are operating perfectly the same, but to help make sure that his neck doesn't get too strained, his body finds that this and this, all these other organizations are what help him see. That's great. But what if he likes doing really symmetrical, challenging things, like a lot of exercisers do? What if we could find out what influence this is having on the rest of the system? And so that's what I started to discover through this assessment, is when he told me that information. When someone tells me something about an organ that's been changed for a really long time, their entire life, or it supersedes the reason why they came in to see me. Like another example is I had a client come in very quickly, and he had a inguinal hernia surgery on his left side. He was a 43-year-old guy when he was 20. Very common procedure, very common, right? They go in, they put a mesh screen in, that mesh screen becomes a part of your anatomy, your tissue grows into it, it helps to make sure you don't have the hernia pop out, it cleans everything up, it's great. And then 10 years later, he had this incredible back injury on the same side, on the back side. And so coming in, as most clients do, he was concerned about his back. He's like, I want my back to get stronger. I want to do all this stuff for this. Well, taking the assessment information, is it possible that the modification to how the flexors would contract because of the screen in his inguinal hernia could be influencing how he moves in his midsection and puts all that extra force into another joint system, like his back? And for him, absolutely it was. Using different forms of QMAM, like qualitative manual motor control tests, when I asked him to flex his abdominals, there was a huge difference in how he performed from the left side to the right side. So I don't know for sure, but I like knowing these things because it does help. And sometimes there's a really big influence and sometimes there isn't, but we have to start somewhere. So what I'm gonna do is, instead of going over the range of motion of Darian, because I think what we'll do is we'll save that for next week, I wanna go over some of the stuff that we did in the assessment process that told me more about the ocular motor control system to the right and how I used it. And then we'll take that range of motion and talk about how the range of motion and the posture kind of come together and how we can make inferences from, create hypothesis from this to figure out, well, what are we going to do for our first exercise session? What should we try to maybe avoid?
So really quickly, so everything on the left side of the page, that's just all postural.
Mm-hmm.
Right side of the page, that's range of motion.
Yeah, great quote.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I normally don't do my profiles like this, but how I'm doing it for this one is everything over here where the right is, but technically the left side of the page. This is all passive postural differences, minus this red line, because it just didn't make sense with this. I'll explain when we get to that point. That just helped me with remembering. So that's why I wrote the eye thing. This is all stuff that's not moving and not changing. Everything in the middle here is the information I collected through the assessment and the test session, kind of like my first experiment with his body and exercise. And then all of this is anatomical range of motion. Red are sagittal plane motions, green are transverse, and then what looks like black here, unfortunately, but it's actually blue. My scanner app didn't work too well. These are actually supposed to be blue. These are frontal plane motions. So we'll talk about how the range of motion connects to the postural stuff next time, because it's absolutely prudent, especially when we're doing motion-related stuff, contraction-related stuff. But let's just talk about this assessment here. So if you've taken, hey Lou, have you seen this information before?
No, not presented like this.
Okay. So all of this right here is in the muscle system specialist program that Greg Mack developed, and I'm a teacher for through Exercise Professional Education. So it's not really a strata secret, I definitely would say. This is just my personal analysis of how I'm using this information and how I connect it to exercise. So if you want more information on that, I'll put a resource up in the Microsoft Teams page so you can check that out just to get more data. But what I'm doing here is once we got this postural information, I have two different sets of force tests that I'm doing. So not using manual muscle tests, and if someone has a difference from one side to the other, I'm not making a binary inference of saying, okay, this was weak and this was strong. Although sometimes those words will come up in conversations. It's easier for a client to talk about that felt weak, that felt strong. What I'm really interested in is what are the differences from one side to the other. So if I do a supine hip abduction test of 30 degrees, like they do in clinical kinesiology, I push on the left side, and then I push on the right side. do both of those feel the same to me? And do both of those feel the same to the client? And if they don't feel the same to either one of us or both of us, that's really important to me. Because theoretically, following that same biological rule of symmetry, we should be able to produce force equally from one side to the other. Now, arguably, as Darian brought up when we were doing this, when you're doing some of these tests with the client, they might say, well, I've never done this before. This is weird. Can I redo it? Absolutely. I would say do it a few times, because there's a potential effect that if you're doing a 7 a.m. client and you're pushing on someone's hip and it moves and they haven't done any exercise, that maybe they haven't pendiculated that morning and stretched to stimulate everything. There's no potentiation that's happened in that area. And as a byproduct, they're just not prepared. Or there could be something going on internally that's reducing their ability to produce force and sustain that position. Maybe. So when I did this system action reaction screening, there are a few tests with Darian from one side to the other that showed up to be kind of different, where he remarked they felt different and they felt different to me. So his left hip abduction, when he was laying on his back, was lower quality output compared to the right. His left hip abduction inflection was lower quality, a positive test compared to the right. His right side trunk rotation, ironically enough, was lower quality when I assessed it from one side to the other. And his hip flexed and externally rotated, kind of pushing out a little bit into abduction, similar to clinical kinesiology's SOAS test, showed up as low quality. And we had all of these here. Now, all of these are different from the other side, from one side to the other. The other side felt very, very strong and robust. This side didn't feel super strong. So I'd like to make note of this just to see, because I'm wondering, do any of these low quality strength tests play into what's going on here at all? Is it possible? But already we've kind of got an interesting case study, even just from a postural perspective and motor control, motor output perspective. Darian's sitting down to the right. He's got more weight on his right side compared to the left. So how his body's interpreting physics when he's standing, it's really only 1% of his weight, but that's still, well, 1.2, but still it's a difference. And we've got all this stuff here where his left side, and right side rotation are all showing up low quality. Now, just playing the hypothetical game to try and add a bit of framing here, right? We see left, right, left. Now, this isn't going to be necessarily true, but let's see how this sounds. If he had this right side atrophy, and I'm doing an abduction test where I just push on his leg, and there's no support on the other side of the body except for the table. My hand's not there. His other leg's pushing into the table. I push on him. Which direction, if I'm pushing from the left inward, which direction am I applying force? To the right. I'm applying force to his right, which means that if I'm applying force to his right, that what's going to happen to the other leg is that other leg and the torso is going to have to apply force to the right into the table, which means the table is going to push to the left opposite into that leg pushing into the table. Does that make sense? Does that make sense, Lou? Cool. So if that's the case, that means that that right leg needs to be able to produce force out into the table with the resistance of the table pushing back onto it, and that right leg, that right hip abduction, that right lateral knee muscle, potentially the lower leg, potentially the lower back, all of this stuff is going to need to be able to produce force adequately to meet my force on the other leg. So if I apply force on his left leg and it's low quality, it's possible that the left leg itself could be low quality, or the right leg's ability to push into the table could be low quality, which we have this atrophy here. Now, I'm going to sound biased through this example because I want to try to give a bit of framing to help kind of get at how some of this stuff could happen, because we're going to find that it actually has nothing to do with this, but just to get us thinking about it, that if we see to the left, if we have a problem on the right side trunk system, it is absolutely possible that the right side lateral flexors, rotators, extensors of the trunk are producing an inadequate amount of force, which is giving us these false positive tests. That kind of makes sense? Here's why I like to do so many different force tests. Now, as a quick side note,
How do you know it's false positive?
yeah, that's a great question. And that's where you have to do more because you don't know initially. And that's kind of like the point where I'm saying, like, I'm going to sound biased by saying this, because right now I can't just look at this and go, this is a false positive. But we can try to prove that, right? How could we prove or disprove, right? If we're thinking, this abduction left, abduction flexion left, flex external rotation abduction left, I think these might be false positives. What could we do to try to prove that hypothesis or disprove it? Because I like disproving it as much as I like proving it, because disproving it gives us more direction.
Anchoring
Yeah, anchoring would be a great thing. Where could we anchor?
on
Yeah, well, that would be a great place. That'd be an interesting place to start, is apply an anchor to the head. You apply anchor to the head, that's going to change where the body's pushing into the table a little bit.
I was thinking, because we're doing abduction, I call it abduction, but abduction, flexion, external rotation, anchor on the other hip, so contralaterally.
So you mean, we got a couple suggestions here. I like it. This is not super convenient. Hey, give me my mark. Where'd my pen go? We still got this? There we go. So Anna's saying, are you going to move for me, please? Help me out here, screen. There we go. Okay, so we got two suggestions, and I like both. Oh, gosh. There we go. Okay, so Liz suggested, oh, gosh. Okay, so Liz suggested right here, and Anna suggested up at the head, and I think that really both those suggestions and everything in between are great. Because we could, and I would suggest whenever you're thinking of trying to check these things, you gonna help me out here, annotation? Nope. Okay, not helping me out, annotation. So if we start, and I would suggest starting closer to the system you're assessing and then move away unless you have evidence. Now, here's what's interesting. Because we've got this eye thing, we could.
That's why I said because they had the head.
Yeah, because, and I love that, because since we've got this right side head thing, it would be interesting to see if we apply force. And I mean this, it's going to be weird, right? Because you're putting your hand on the abduction, you're trying to put your other hand on the side of their head. You could use seatbelts. However, I wouldn't recommend putting a seatbelt on a first-time client. I might try to figure out how to do that, but I wouldn't recommend it. But
Would
if you
it not generate too much torque, given the lever length from where you're working and the rigidity, use that for lack of a better term,
where annotations
in holding the head?
well,
You've got a lot of systems in between, including your.
But then if you put it like across your chest, for example, it will influence the closest to it. And it might actually help to do the furthest one out.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. The torque, it wouldn't be necessarily too high unless you're pushing real hard. Because if you think about, I like how that's a great way of thinking of it, but this thing is just in the way, there we go. If you apply the hand to the head and you push on the other leg and you increase your force production to the point that person's head is moving on the table, that's a lot of torque. But also as a practitioner, for most folks, I would say that wouldn't even be probably possible unless you have unless you're super strong and you've got a really light person. Like Darian being 14 years old, if he was a light 14-year-old, you might spin him right off the table.
Well, and
but
also the practitioners on arm span.
Right, but here's an interesting thing that could happen, right? Let's work with it both ways. So if we apply force to the head first, we go really, really far away. We apply force to one side of the head or both sides of the head, which we could talk about which side we want to do that based off of where the center of mass of the body is. But say we do it on the right side and the left side, and we're still getting a low quality hip. Then we move our hand down to the shoulder, and we do the same test, and it's high quality. Suddenly, the evidence that we just got from the hand placement test really goes up, because now we're seeing, okay, when we're using the lateral flexors of the neck on whichever side we applied the anchoring to, which is another conversation just based off of the weight of the individual, that anchoring system is producing a low quality reaction in the system. When I move my hand down 12 inches to the shoulder, that increases the quality of the hip test. which would be really interesting because if we took a dynamometer, and again, not seatbelt, but if we could take our hands out of the equation, right? We seatbelt their head to the table, and then we apply a dynamometer to hip abduction, and we say, push out as hard as you can versus down to the thoracic spine and then push out. Besides the obvious distance and length from the system, we might see a really dramatic change in the numbers of force production in the hip abduction system due to the poor anchoring of the neck from the oculomotor complex, or not. Because the other side of it too is if we went all the way down and we put force onto the head and we did the test, low quality. Force on the shoulder, hip abduction, low quality. Force on the iliac crest, removing thoracic and lumbar spine, hip abduction, low quality. All of a sudden, the other side of the coin is this anchoring change that you mentioned, which is great, changes the test to be such that, it might actually be a hip quality issue rather than the ability of the body to push into the table. So to answer kind of everybody's question, that's the best way to figure it out. Because if you apply force to an individual, and you push them in abduction, or they do a potentiation test into a dynamometer, and the left side says 13 lbf, right says 25 lbf. We have to consider all of the anchoring options, because you can't just look at that without data and going, you have weak hip abductors, we got to strengthen those suckers. Because if not, your knee's going to go into valgus, your foot's going to pronate. That's possible. But with those different placements, that's what we're going to really figure out potentially the influence. Because how interesting, right? Talking about an exercise strategy. How many of us really do cervical spine exercises with clients? Not very often. And it's kind of weird. If you go, hey client, we're going to do neck crunches for the first exercise. A lot of clients are going to be like, what? Like, why would you apply that first? Right? But
The machine for neck looks scary, like a torture device.
yeah. Well, when we get back down to the floor, we'll go, Lou, we've got the old, you've been to Oklahoma?
Yeah. I was playing with that thing actually. I was actually down there last September around this time. And I was playing with that little neck machine.
Yeah, we've got the same multi-neck that Tom's got, and it's very intimidating, very powerful, and we definitely don't use it enough because there's some great stuff that comes from it.
Have you
But
seen those head things?
yeah, the halo.
Plates on?
Oh, plates?
No, you put the plate, so you put it on your head and you attach plates on and
Yeah, so
you do
it
this.
like pulls you. It pulls you down. So
I just get blown away when I see people doing that, and they're like,
yeah.
they're like headbanging with the weights on. I'm like, this is crazy. So how interesting it would be, though, is if we did any one of the assessments that gives us influence of the neck, right? Like Anna suggests, we put the hand on the outside of the head. It's a low quality test. We move the hand to the shoulder, and it's strong. So now we have inference that potentially when we have the involvement of the right side lateral flexors of the neck, it makes the rest of the body potentially slightly incapable of producing force. So how interesting would it be if we use Tom's creepy cervical machine, or we come up with our own lateral flexion exercise, that we just exercise right side lateral flexors to see how it changes the rest of the body. But what's nice about this is two things happen. We have evidence to suggest that. Rather than going, you know what, necks are really important, we're going to exercise the neck first. We actually have mechanical evidence. And then after you do that exercise, because you have the step one evidence, you can take that a priori information and you can redo the test to see, did that neck exercise make the change that we wanted?
Like we did the potentiation, when you do it 5 times and then you redo the test.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly like that. So what we could do, and this is where, Lou, and we'll talk more about this, this is where I'm a big fan of learning more about post-activation potentiation, motor learning, short-term and long-term potentiation effects, both from a functional and anatomical perspective, which if you've done anything with Jacques-Henri Taylor, you've probably heard bits and bobs about that stuff because he's a wizard with the nervous system stuff, right? If we just do 5 contractions to the right side, and then we go back to that same test, hand on outside of the head, hip abduction, and it's increased in quality. We now have evidence that that one exercise has created not only a local change to the neck, but a systemic reaction. And so that's what I wrote down here, which we'll get more into next week, so we should be wrapping up for a few minutes so we can all get to work, is that I wanted to do, and we did that. I had a possibility in my head that the right side ocular motor system, looking to the right, either looking to the right with both eyes or the right eye, was going to influence how his body was producing force. And it did. But what I wrote down here, as I kind of mentioned, I want to know what the systemic change would be, because you really can't. I mean, when people are saying like, we're going to work out your eyes, you can do some stuff for that, but you really can't measure the effect. But you can measure the effect of how the eyes influence the rest of the body or other organs.
I think we did that on the sports.
We did.
What's the guy?
Connor.
Connor.
Which we may never see again because he lives in your land. And I don't know how many of you guys are going to be able to come over here anymore because of this whole crazy COVID stuff. In any event, yeah, we did do that,
Yeah,
and there'll be more.
His eyes, and then it changed.
Yeah, and so I think any organ where there's muscles that we have the opportunity for contract, like the eyes and like the mouth and the respiratory system, are areas that we don't necessarily collect data on, but absolutely could influence how the body is producing force. So I'm going to wrap. We're going to talk more about Darian next week. And then once we get through Darian's profile, I think what we'll do, if you're okay with it, maybe we can do your data analysis next. What I'll do is, Lou, I'm going to do Anna's, and then we'll play with Liz. We'll figure out, Taylor's got Liz's information, but we can either collect new information and we'll just kind of go through everybody here and talk about this information. Does anyone have any questions before we wrap up today?
The only question I might have is with the ocular finding, is it a genetic asymmetry or is it correctable by glasses or contact lenses? Or...
Apparently not.
Okay. So not correctable. Cool. Great. And that's a great question to ask when you're working with the person for sure. Any other questions? Lou, do you have any questions about this?
Nah, more just taking everything in.
Cool. Does this meet your expectations?
It's been awesome. Yeah, no, it's awesome. Really, really helpful, and some different stuff that I haven't seen before. So really helpful.
Cool, Lou. Well, welcome to the mix. And everybody, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it. We will continue the Darian mat exploration and postural range of motion conversation next week. All right, everybody.
Cool.
Have a great one. We'll talk to you
Thanks,
soon.
guys.
See you later.
Take it easy, guys. Thanks.